Before you close your eyes tonight, ask yourself one thing. What if the forest just beyond your town isn't sleeping when you are? What if it remembers you? What if it's been waiting? Welcome back. I am Night Whispers. I know many of you listen as you fall asleep, letting the darkness wrap around you. Before you drift off, leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from. And if my stories haunt your dreams just right, you know what to do. Like and subscribe. Now hush. It's time to listen. And whatever you do, don't follow the woman in white. Story 5. I am a forester, and I encountered something I can't explain in an old-growth forest. I am posting this because I am truly out of options. My employers refuse to take my reports, and have even threatened termination of my contract if I bring these events back to the table again. The local authorities are dismissive, or even worse, accuse me of substance abuse and mental instability. I can't even tell my own family, lest they draw the same conclusions. I wouldn't want to drag them into this anyway. Hopefully some of you people can help me, at least help me understand what is going on. I have worked as a forester in Appalachia for a logging company that will go unnamed for nearly a decade now. In that time I have come to love my job, the woods, and the freedom that accompanies both. But things have started to change with my most recent assignment. God, the woods used to feel so safe, so clean. Now I can't stop my hands from shaking when I stand beneath the green canopy. So we're all on the same page. I'll walk you through the fieldwork of my profession. First, the company assigns me a tract of land they have recently acquired. I do some less exciting prep work in the office, satellite imaging, GIS, property analysis, etc., and then I head out into the field. Generally, the sites are pretty far from the offices, requiring multiple-hour drives and overnight camping. I bring along some simple camping gear, tape measures, manual clinometer and altimeter, bright neon orange marking spray paint, and my GPS transmitter and marker. All in all, a bunch of technical nonsense that lets me determine the value of trees, which should be logged, and which should be left behind to ensure no permanent damage is done to the forest. Simple enough. It was early morning on September 21st, 2019, when my office desktop pinged that I had an incoming email. Seeing that it was an assignment from corporate, I opened it up and nearly let out a cheer in my cubicle. The tract I had been assigned was a huge patch of old-growth forest located near the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. For those of you who don't know, an old-growth forest is a wooded area that has not been disturbed for hundreds of years, allowed to grow and develop in its natural state without intervention by farming, construction, or logging. Many old-growth forests haven't been touched since the settlers arrived, and some even before then. In any case, this was a cause for celebration. Old growth is increasingly rare and amazingly beautiful, and I was the one assigned to explore it. Of course, this was bittersweet, seeing as I would be the last to see it undespoiled before I gave the loggers the go-ahead. I spent the morning in the office packing my things and loading them into the tiny white Ford Ranger, lovingly nicknamed Piper, that the company had provided to me when I started working for them. She was a rugged little thing, having carried me through the mountains for almost a decade without protest. Of course, she wasn't without her quirks: crank-operated windows, a rattling tailgate, and an AC that hadn't functioned since 2011. But I loved that tiny little truck. Piper and I set out around noon, making good time on the 4 hours drive through the rugged depths of West Virginia. We arrived at the old trailhead that would deliver me to my tract late into the afternoon. As I strapped my heavy backpack on and locked Piper up for her stay at the edge of the woods, I breathed deeply, taking in the heavy scent of forest earth and the sound of wind and birdsong through the treetops. Giving my truck a pat on the hood, I turned and made my way off the country road and onto the narrow dirt track that wound into the woods. The hike to the old-growth stand of trees took about an hour of brisk trekking, the path becoming more and more overgrown as I progressed. It was obvious this trail hadn't been consistently used for years, probably decades. Nearly to my destination, I happened across what should have been the first sign that something was not right. An ancient sycamore tree stood in the dead center of the path. Had it been any other species, I would have sidestepped it and kept plugging ahead, but sycamores had always been my favorite trees, so I craned my neck upwards to admire the old beauty. About 12 feet off the ground, twisted and woven through a tangle of white-barked branches, was the decomposing skeleton of a deer, scraps of rotting fur and mummified tendons the only things holding the carcass together as it dangled from the tree. I gasped and stepped back from the initial shock, the staring skeletal visage of an old deer being the last thing I had expected to see. My first thought was that a mountain lion or similar predator had hauled the animal up there to feast upon. Carnivores like that were pretty rare in the area, but I had guessed it wasn't entirely out of the question. But my confusion spiked and the rumblings of dread gestated in my gut when I looked just a little bit closer. It was difficult to tell due to the distance from the forest floor and amount of time the deer had been up there, but as I squinted and stared, I noticed something haunting. The decrepit animal remains were not simply jumbled in the tree branches, they were lashed into place by scraps of rope and cloth. Someone had hauled that deer 12 feet up this sycamore tree and tied its limbs and joints so it would stay suspended up there. Directly beneath the nearly completely rotted animal, barely visible due to age, was carved a simple O, presumably slashed into the bark by whoever took the time to create this macabre installation. I was understandably shocked and confused by this discovery, but the apparent age of the carving and carcass eased my worries a little. Whoever had done this had obviously done their work months ago. I resolved that until I happened across fresher work, I was unlikely to run into anyone else out here in the woods. Having reassured myself for the moment and excited to lay eyes on rare old growth, I carried on down the trail towards my destination. I reached the edge of my assigned stand around 6:30 that night, the old ill-maintained trail terminating in a small clearing on the border of the forest I hiked through and the secluded acres of the old growth that waited beyond. I gazed awestruck at what waited for me, ancient gnarled tree trunks that soared stories high, capped with dense foliage that cast the groves beneath in placid twilight. One of the defining features of old growth is the lack of an understory, smaller plants choked of sunlight by the canopy above. This means that you can see much further than you could in a different forest, where brush and vines might block your view. In the old growth ahead of me, I could see deep into the canopy-shaded woods, darkness enveloping trees that grew in twisted and gnarled shapes, ancient beings shaped by countless years into warped and beautiful lines. I was nearly overtaken by the sight, a view that so few people are able to look upon in this modern age. Even though I was nearly shaking with excitement to explore the acres-large stand of forest ahead of me, I knew that daylight would not last much longer. I would have to push off starting my work until the next day, working quickly to pitch my tent and create a small stone ring to act as my fire pit before nightfall overtook my new campsite. That first night on the edge of the old growth was so quiet. As I lay tightly wrapped in my sleeping bag, staring up through the vent net in the roof of my tent towards the stars above, I heard almost none of the sounds one might expect from camping deep in the woods. No night birds called, no insects buzzed. The only sounds were the rushing of wind through the leaves and, once, the mournful sound of an owl hooting somewhere within the ancient grove beyond my camp. I sat there awake in the eerie silence nearly the entire night, partially perturbed by the quiet but mostly entranced by the beauty of the starlit sky and filled with excitement for the day to come. I eventually drifted off to sleep around 2 a.m. At 5:30 in the morning, I was awoken by the electronic chirping of my watch alarm, signaling the start of my day. Groggily sitting up, I immediately regretted not forcing myself to sleep earlier. Yanking the zipper of the tent flap and exposing myself to the chill morning air, I rose to a stoop and began to exit my tent. As my head left the tent, I stopped dead, frozen and staring. I was staring down the barrel of a pump-action shotgun, clutched in the hands of a middle-aged bearded man. He wore old flannel and denim, a stained old baseball cap over a mop of graying hair. His face was cracked and split by intricate wrinkles, the telltale aging endured by a man who had spent his life outdoors. His gray eyes squinted as he met my shocked gaze, lowering the gun. Well shit, I'm sorry, son. Didn't expect anybody. What the hell do you mean you didn't expect anybody? I asked, anger boiling to the surface as the shock of surprise ebbed away. You walked into a campsite at 5 in the morning. Why wouldn't there be anybody here? His gnarled face didn't change from its stony demeanor. Look, boy, I said I was sorry. No harm, no foul, right? He shrugged nonchalantly, irritatingly dismissive of the fact that he had a loaded gun pointed between my eyes mere moments ago. He slung the weapon over his shoulder and extended a hand to help me up out of my tent. Most tents you find up here are empty. It took a moment for what he had said to sink in. What do you mean? Like people come up here, dump their trashed old equipment. Disappointment began to brew as the thought of the old growth filled with trash entered my mind. Nah, son, nothing like that. Just exactly what I said. The tents you find up here are always empty. The name's Randy. Randy Davidson. This plot belonged to my grandpa, and his grandpa before him. His West Virginia drawl was thick and slow as he gestured towards the old growth stand. Before Grandpa sold it to the National Forest folks, eminent domain and whatnot. I furrowed my brow. Not only had I had the shock of my life less than a minute ago, now I was listening to the family history of some Appalachian backwater hick. My patience grew thin. So is that why you go poking around in other people's shit, scaring them half to death when they wake up? For old time's sake. Randy squinted again, unimpressed with my impatience. Look, boy. All I'm gonna say is that you better watch yourself out in these woods. Grandpa used to tell stories. Was happy to have the feds take the land off his hands. Just pack up and leave is my advice. And with that he turned and started walking away in the direction he came from. I stood there in uneasy silence and just watched him go. What the hell? Was that a warning or a threat? And what could he have possibly meant about empty tents? His message had surprised and confused me as much as his sudden appearance in my camp. The early morning light grew brighter and the mist that clung to the ground burned away as I gathered my things and prepared for my first foray into the old growth stand. I nearly inhaled my breakfast, excited to start my work. Then, pack filled and secured, I stepped beyond the edge of the grove. The old growth was breathtaking. Ancient gnarled trees surrounded me as I walked, dark twisting shapes disappearing into the shadowy canopy high above. No underbrush cluttered the ground, just stoic old boulders and thick sheets of soggy moss. The dense cover of leaves above cast the entire huge stand in the eerie pall of cool shade. The heavy earthy scent of loamy earth and wetwood filled my nose and lungs. Pristine silence filled the forest. I set to work immediately, invigorated by my utterly gorgeous surroundings. The noise I made was the only sound to echo through the ancient woods around me, joining the quiet wind in the leaves above. I identified species, measured trunk diameters, calculated height and slope, judged quality timber from trees best left standing. God damn, I had thought to myself. Almost all of these trees were worth thousands of dollars in timber as individuals. This stand of old growth alone would likely net the company over $1 million after harvest. How in hell had this place not been logged yet? With a metallic rattle and aerosol hiss, I marked the trees that would be harvested with my flagging paint. With the forest floor so clear of undergrowth, the bright orange Bexes I sprayed on the tree trunks could be seen in the distance in every direction, looming out of the darkness in their obviously unnatural neon hue. It felt strange to be painting this place, so long left beyond the reach of humanity. It was after 4 p.m. and I was finishing up the last sections of the stand I had decided to work on today. There was a small, low valley near the center of the old growth, edged by mossy boulders and muddy slopes. I had nearly finished marking the chosen trees in the valley when I came across something hauntingly strange. As I rounded the massive trunk of a beautiful old red oak, I saw it. Sitting in the middle of a tiny clearing, shaded by the dark leaves above, was the rusted hulk of an old RV. The paint was chipped and peeled away almost to the point of non-existence, though there was still enough left to make out the classic script of Winnebago. The tires were flat, flaccid sacks of rubber draped over rusted hubcaps. Moss grew over the windows of the abandoned vehicle, at least where the glass hadn't shattered and dropped away. The side door hung limply open on failing hinges, revealing nothing but inky darkness inside. I slowly approached the derelict, wet moss and leaves squelching under my boots. How did this thing get down here? There's no way it could have been driven down the steep slopes of the valley, and there weren't any signs that it had fallen or crashed down here. Besides the ravages of time, the old RV seemed undamaged. I stepped within a few feet of the Winnebago's open door. I fumbled through my backpack and produced my flashlight, noticing that the vehicle was ringed by a thick layer of heavy gray mud. Spurred by curiosity, I clicked my flashlight on and stepped on board the ruined RV through the broken door. As I did so, the entire vehicle let out a wretched moan as rusted springs shifted for the first time in what had likely been decades. I threw a glance back over my shoulder into the forest, suddenly feeling watched. All I noticed through the forest gloom were the neon orange spexes I had painted on the trees, pointed at haphazard angles and partially hidden by gnarled trunks. The interior of the RV was dark as night, even with the gloomy daylight filtering through some small sections of broken windows. The stark white beam of my flashlight cut through the blackness, a circle of vision too small for comfort. Something felt off the moment I was inside. The cabin of the vehicle was almost empty, driver and passenger seats devoured down to the metal frames by generations of vermin. Crusty lichen encased the steering column. The cup holders held two old metal thermoses, the words #1dad and #1mom just barely visible through the years of sylvan filth that had accumulated upon them. I turned to face the main living space of the old wreck, silence thick on the air and only cut through by the agonized creaks of the moldering floor beneath me. The built-in couch here had suffered the same fate as the cabin seats, devoured by rats and insects searching for a nest. Cupboards hung open near the low ceiling, cardboard boxes of food within reduced to pulp and slurry by years of exposure. I shone my needle of light across the room, noticing the narrow door at the rear. It hung barely ajar, a crack of darkness presumably leading to the RV's bedroom. As I stepped closer, the stench of mildew and wet dirt grew almost overpowering. With a groan of rusty hinges, I pushed the door open. My blood ran cold as my flashlight beam settled on what waited beyond the doorway. Shocked, my breaths came quick and shallow as I took in the sight. The room held a bed, mattress, and blankets untouched by foraging pests, but stained a deep black brown by mold and God knows what else. Upon the bed was a heap of clothing, gathered from the suitcases haphazardly left to rot on the floor around the bed. The clothes were stained the same foul shade as the mattress. I could make out at least 4 distinct sizes of clothing in the pile, 2 adults and 2 children. The stink of rotting vegetation was unimaginable. My hands shook, bobbing my light as they did so, as I gazed at the top of the pile. Atop the wet heap of moldy old clothing was the dripping carcass of a deer, limbs broken and twisted at unnatural angles to allow the decaying thing to be propped in a pose like a man sitting cross-legged. Its head was bowed towards me, what was left of the meat blackened by rot and sloughing from its skull beneath lichen-coated antlers. Its eyes had long since liquefied, dripping down its cheeks in curdled rivulets and leaving empty black sockets to stare into the dark. The cluster of mossy and scattered bones by the headboard revealed that this was merely the most recent animal left here, the next in a long line of slaughtered deer propped up in this macabre. Despite the dribbling animal wreckage before me, there was no smell of rotting meat, just the singularly wretched and overpowering odor of composting vegetation and decomposing fungus. Acrid vomit filled my mouth and sinuses, and I bolted for the door behind me. As I stuck my head and shoulders outside and prepared to retch, my eyes laid upon fresh horror. The bright orange of my marking paint, sprayed at haphazard in dissonant angles as I had wandered the valley, all faced towards me in uniform stares. Every X I had painted down here looked towards me, neon color cutting through the forest gloom like electric eyes. The remainder of the food left my stomach, replaced by ice water as I lurched forward and vomited messily upon the mossy ground. Leaning from inside the RV, body shaking with confusion and terror, I hummed my head and wiped the bitter puke from my mouth and tears from my eyes. The smell of rotting wood still clogged my nostrils. I stared at the splatter of fresh vomit below me, attempting to comprehend what I was looking at. The steaming bile was collecting in a footprint in the sticky gray mud. My shaky breath rattled in my lungs as I stared. It was unmistakable. Fresh tracks marred the mud that surrounded the derelict RV, a complete circle that stalked around the vehicle. They were deep, pressed into the muck by something big and heavy. The tracks took the shape of half of a human foot, the long toes and forefoot evident like the tracks of someone walking barefoot and tiptoeing. Jesus Christ, even the partial footprints were bigger than the tracks I had left. How had something so large moved so quietly around the RV? I hadn't heard a thing from inside. I rose to trembling feet and took a cautious step outside. The old growth was utterly silent beyond my nervous panting. The bright orange X's still stared in my direction, not a one where I had originally placed it. Shit, I thought to myself. I stood, scanning the empty forest floor and listening for any sounds to pierce the quiet. Seconds passed, feeling like an eternity, and then I bolted. Blood pounded in my ears as I sprinted through the forest, never once slowing as I made for camp. The feeling of a cold, calculating gaze from unseen eyes never left my back as I ran. I skidded into my tiny camp on the edge of the stand as the sun began to dip in the darkening sky, nearly collapsing with exhaustion as the daylight that filtered through the trees above began to die. As I panted and gasped with exertion, I surveyed my surroundings, my tent and fire ring appearing untouched since I left this morning. As dusk settled over the forest, my surroundings began to darken. It wouldn't be long until they were as black as the old growth at my back. There was no way I could leave tonight. Even if I wasn't petrified to be out in the dark, there wasn't a chance in hell I could find my way back to Piper through black and unfamiliar woods. My mind raced as daylight failed around me. Do I set a fire and hope light and flame keeps whatever was out here at bay? Or do I sit in the darkness and pray that I stay hidden in a shadowy and silent camp? There were no good options. My bowels knotted inside me as I fought to keep panic from setting in. Eventually, the primal instincts of my cave-dwelling ancestors kicked in. Fire was the one tool that had always served our kind against the darkness and the things that lurked within it. I piled all of my firewood into the rain. I wouldn't need it for another night, and as night fell, the glowing light of my bonfire lit the forest around me, faltering at the edge of the old growth. My camp bathed in firelight. I climbed inside my tent and sealed the zipper shut. I sat silently inside the thin nylon shell for hours, listening as the wind made the only sound beyond the crackling of my fire which glowed through the walls of the tent. My hands shook and my spine prickled with nerves. My teeth chattered despite the humid heat that clung to my body, sweat dripping from my brow. I moved slowly to check my watch. 3:30 a.m. Less than 2 hours until the first break of daylight, less than 2 hours until I could flee this place. I jolted as a sudden snap shattered the silence, the sharp cracking noise emanating not 20 feet from my tent and followed by staccato rustling before deathly silence. My eyes were wide, breath caught in my throat. The quiet, nearly imperceptible rustling came again. Whatever was outside was still there. I slowly grasped the zipper pull with my left hand, while fumbling about with my right until it came to rest upon my pocket knife. It was a feeble little thing, barely helpful as a tool for whittling, but as a gift from my dad it always found its way into my pack. With my impotent little blade clutched tight, I opened the door of my tent, agonizingly slowly to keep the zipper quiet. I crept out into the night, The chill air shockingly cooled as it connected with my overheated and clammy skin. The bonfire still burned, though it had run low as the night dragged on. Silently surveying the camp before me, I searched for the source of the hushed sound. Slowly my gaze was drawn upwards into the boughs of the trees. Two eyes reflected in the firelight, staring back at me. Shock gripped my heart, and it took all of my willpower not to exclaim with fear and surprise. The eyes cocked to the side, as if judging me. With more quiet rustles, the owl shifted on its branch, close enough that the firelight revealed its identity. Relief flooded my body, and I let out a quiet sigh. Then true terror overtook me as I noticed the huge shape in my peripheral vision. I slowly turned my head, tears welling up in my eyes. It sat waiting on its haunches barely 6 feet away from me, dimly lit by the embers of the slowly dying fire. At first I thought it was a huge man, a giant living in the woods. But this thing was no human. Never could have been. It sat nearly curled in a fetal ball, long arms clasped to scrawny legs and shoulders hunched. Completely naked, its humanoid form was covered in greasy, pale skin stretched taut over knobby bones and joints. Black-gray veins pulsed beneath its thin flesh. The thing's elongated arms and legs were triple-jointed, digitigrade like the hind legs of a repulsively malnourished and hairless goat. Its arms ended in hands each bearing 6 long and twitching fingers tipped with ragged and blackened nails. Its legs terminated in feet that may have been human, if they were not twisted and deformed to allow the thing to walk on its mud and filth-caked toes. It carried an unbearable stench of fungus and compost. But most horrible of all was its face. Atop its spindly neck rested the thing's gaunt head, oily and pale skin reflecting the guttering flames in the fire pit. Its nose and chin were hideously long and crooked, not unlike the jagged and pointed features stereotypical of ancient witches. Its mouth was wide and lipless, flesh pulled back to reveal black gums and long, blunted teeth that looked as if they had been taken from a human jaw and stretched cartoonishly to fit this horror's skull. Though it had no eyes, it stared intently at the owl in the tree. No, not eyeless. The twisted and hulking creature crouched beside me slowly turned its head to face me. Barely visible, white orbs rolled and twitched in sunken eye sockets, bulging underneath a pallid and thin membrane of flesh. The horror stared silently at me before raising a single finger to its lipless and drooling teeth. It let out a quiet, gurgling breath. Shoo! Panic set my body ablaze. I scrambled to my feet, dropping my tiny pocket knife into the mud. The owl let out a shrieking protest as it took flight, spooked by my sudden movement. As I stumbled backwards, starting my sprint into the pitch-black forest, the thing rose to its feet on tri-jointed legs. Good God, the thing had to have been at least 7 feet tall, but its body moved without making a sound. As I turned and ran, it let out a hideous gasping screech, a sound laden with ancient hate. I didn't look back, dashing through the underbrush away from the old growth and leaving an empty tent to join the others Randy had found. I don't know if it followed me. It was so big, but it moved so silently. As I ran, I didn't see it, didn't hear it. But the feeling of its gaze never left me. I ran blindly in the dark, whipping branches and bramble thorns slashing my face and hands seemingly to ribbons. Blood and sweat drenched me, cooling in my hiking boots. I don't know how long I ran. At some point I must have collapsed with exhaustion, blacking out in the depths of the forest. I woke up in the glaring shine of daylight, filtering down onto my face through the trees. My face and hands were caked with blood and dirt. At least 2 of my fingers were broken, or at least dislocated. Rising on shaking legs, I began my blind trek into the unfamiliar woods around me, hopelessly lost. I walked for hours, likely wandering in circles. My face and hands ached with dull, pulsing pain. The skin of my chest itched and burned underneath my shirt. Finally, I stumbled onto the forest trail, old and ill-maintained. I couldn't believe my luck. I had resigned myself to being lost, dying alone and hunted deep in unsettled Appalachia. Tears welled up as I hurriedly limped down the path, and I nearly shouted with elation when Piper came into view. Fumbling with my keys, I managed to unlock her and climb inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. As I fired the ignition and the truck started up, the burning on my chest intensified, an awful itching sensation. Grimacing, I quickly set about undoing the buttons of my shirt to see what the cause of my discomfort was. As I did so, a subtle stench of old vegetation began wafting into my truck. I felt cold eyes staring from the fringes of the woods. I pulled my shirt open, exposing my chest and the source of the itch. Across the flesh of my chest, sprayed there with marker paint, was a bright orange X. The day I had been dreading finally came. After months of denied reports, quiet but heated arguments behind my boss's closed door, and the most intense procrastination ever known to man the company, sent me back to the old growth. Good Lord, you have to believe I fought it. But in the end, my protests were less than useless. I would have quit this job if I could, but I had bills to pay, fees to keep my parents cared for in their old age. There was nowhere to hide. The neon orange marker paint that I had discovered sprayed into a forester's X upon my chest had washed away easily enough, but it had left behind an angry red rash of scaly skin and scarlet warmth. The doctor told me that it was likely an allergic reaction to a chemical propellant in the aerosol, or a component of the paint itself. The itching rash had faded over time but never fully disappeared, the faintest ghost of the mark that haunted me just barely visible to those who cared to look close enough. I had completed 1 or 2 assignments since the experience I previously recounted for you all, working in Pennsylvania and around D.C. to mark up and measure tiny stands of trees just outside of bustling suburban corridors. Even in those minuscule groves of adolescent trees and shrubs, the green glow of the canopy sent shivers down my spine and bile rising in my throat. I was a wreck in nearly every sense of the word, and I don't think anyone who believed me could blame me. The problem was that no one actually did believe me, not truly. The email from the company heads came on March 2nd, 2020. When I saw it in my inbox, I had sat silently staring in my cubicle for agonizing minutes before finally resigning myself to cold acceptance. I scanned the details with defeat. Return to parcel. Monongahela National Forest. Work imperative. Multi-million-dollar stake. Depart immediately. Fuck. The rest of that morning is just a foggy blur, dragging myself through my duties in preparation to return to the place where I had encountered something I could not explain. Something I could not forget. It must have been just before noon when Piper and I were roaring down the interstate towards the dreaded grove, acres of black woods and hidden things. God, I shouldn't have gone. I have no recollection of the 4-hour drive into the depths of West Virginia. The next thing I knew, I was standing next to my truck, engine clicking and popping as it cooled and settled, with my heavy pack slung over my shoulders. Ahead of me loomed the narrow trailhead that led to a forest the world had forgotten. Mostly forgotten. With a shuddering breath, I steeled myself and stepped into the woods. The sensation was so strange. My mind was caught in a vicious wrestling match between feelings of mortal terror and the comfort of coming home. I absent-mindedly pawed at the faded mark under my shirt as I tramped along the winding and overgrown path. Thoughts churned and changed within my aching skull. The things I had seen here, half remembered and half unforgettable. The splendor of the unspoiled forest around me. Grinning, lipless teeth. The endless awe of the old growth. I walked in a daze like man towards the gallows, or perhaps towards a holy reliquary. By the time I walked around the old sycamore tree, just a few scant bones left lashed to its branches, I had regained my senses. The sights and sounds of the woods returned to me as I made towards my old campsite. I wiped the watery stuff running from my nose. It was cold out here, only the first buds of the year starting to appear on the branches of the trees. This was about the time I began cursing myself for coming back out here, but it was far too late now. Suddenly I stepped out into the tiny clearing in which I had once made camp. On the far end of the break in the woods waited the boundary of the old grove, looming in ancient trees cast in the shade of dark, dead leaves that still clung to their soaring branches in stark refusal to let sunlight desecrate the floor of the grove. Even in the latest days of winter and the earliest days of spring, shadow ruled the old growth waiting ahead. As I stared, a chill wind whispered from between the tree trunks, stinging my face and whipping through my hair. A grim thought crawled through my mind. Yeah, hello to you too. Pulling my gaze from the dark boundary ahead of me, I surveyed the small clearing. The ground was sodden and muddy with snowmelt, the detritus of winter fading away with the season. The shredded remnants of my old tent stood in half-hearted defiance of gravity, poles bent and broken in angles better suited to modern art. Slowly pulling open the door flap of the mostly collapsed tent, I saw that all of the original contents were missing. My sleeping bag and the backpack I had carried out here previously nowhere to be seen. I let the tent flap fall limply back. There was no salvaging the nylon heap. Just as Randy, the local who had accosted me last time I was here, had said, the tents you find here are always empty. I turned around to check the fire pit less than a dozen feet behind me. The stones were still there, but not as I had left them. The rounded forest stones, now covered in crawling moss and flaking lichen, were stacked in a perfect tower that came up to stomach height. One on top of another, they were balanced immaculately. The slightest breeze should have been enough to upset the delicate cairn, but the stones did not fall. Atop the tower of stones, untouched by vegetation, age, or weather, was my pocket knife, dropped in the shock of my previous encounter here. With a spiteful sniff, I snatched the knife and gave the stones a small kick, letting the tower crumble into a disparate pile. I made camp in the clearing over the next hour or so, pitching my new tent and reconstructing the fire ring. I unfurled the large ball of twine I had brought with me, attaching aluminum cans to it as I laid a tripwire perimeter around my little oasis. Setting an alarm like this would likely do little to help me should something go wrong during my stay here, but it eased my worry just the same. As night fell, I sat by my fire, listening to the silence of this forest that I knew all too well. I awoke in my tent in the early morning rays of sunlight to the tinny buzzing of my watch, letting me know it was time to work. I went through my morning routine, had my breakfast, threw my backpack on, stepped over my tripwire, and marched as stoically as I could muster across the clearing towards the waiting old grove. As I quietly stepped across the mossy floor of the darkened grove, I noticed one thing. My work was gone. All of the bright orange spexes I had marked upon the trees that were to be harvested had disappeared like mist in the wind. That paint was designed to last as long as logging projects may drag on, sometimes years, and I had sprayed it here barely 6 months ago. And now it was all gone. The bark of the trees, barren of paint and gnarled and blackened by hundreds of years, mocked me. Gritting my teeth, I began to work. I toiled for hours that day in the chilly March weather, the ancient forest around me silent beyond the sounds of my work. Measuring, mapping, marking, I went through my tasks quickly and robotically, never once shaking the undeniable sensation of cold eyes on my back. Maybe my fear made me more perceptive, or maybe the forest and what waited within it simply chose to show me more than it had before. Whatever the case, I saw things. Rare sights that punctuated the hours within the stand. Animal bones lashed to and dangling from branches that towered over the muddy ground. A bright yellow hunter's cap, soaked with water and stuffed into a gap between boulders. The rusted lower frame and wheels of an old-fashioned baby carriage. A tangled pile of twine and aluminum cans, new and untouched by age or weather. There was less than an hour of daylight left as I finished up my first day of work. I rounded the thick trunk of a massive honey locust, stinging odor of marker paint still wafting from the fresh X I had marked there. Beyond the old tree was a steep forest pothole, perhaps a sinkhole that had collapsed thousands of years ago. It dropped barely 5 feet down, and maybe 10 feet across. Drawn by some strange human curiosity, I peered over the edge. The sides of the shallow pit were choked with thick roots and sheets of moss, creating a coiled mass of wet vegetation that snaked downwards, dangling into the murky 1.5 foot of rainwater and snowmelt that collected at the bottom of the wide hole. The smell of stagnant water and something far worse rose up to meet my running nose, causing me to recoil and gag at the stench. My mouth went dry and a shiver ran down my spine as I gazed upon what floated in the pit below. Fermented with oozing mud and rotting mold clung to bloated meat which split at joints and folds under the pressures of corpse gas. Skin flensed away from limbs and extremities revealed the darkened and spongy remnants of exposed bone, soaked through with the stinking and stagnant water that filled the pool. A single clouded and milky white eye stared up at me from a face turned aside, suspended in clear sludge that clotted in the socket of a skull barely held together by rotten ribbons of tendon and cartilage. The horrid carcass had at one point been a large dog, perhaps a German shepherd judging from the scattered patches of fur that remained. Strapped across the dog's hollow and collapsing rib cage was the old backpack I had left behind the first time I came to the old growth. The sharp sound of a snapping twig came from behind me, and I whirled to face the noise, sudden shock gripping my racing heart. A man stood there, wrinkled and weather-beaten face below a stained old cap. I recognized Randy Davidson a split second before he spoke. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, recognition sparking in eyes as gray as his hair. The remnants of the rash on my chest throbbed dully. "It's you again. What the hell are you doing back out?" he dashed. His question was suddenly cut short as a massive pale shape lunged from the growing shadows around us, the hulking white thing moving soundlessly as it slammed Randy into the muddy ground. He let out a pained gasp as the air was knocked from his lungs. With inhuman speed it whipped around to face me, and blood ran cold as I laid eyes on its all-too-familiar lipless grin and greasy flesh. The stench of rotting moss wafted over me. Pale orbs rolled and twitched in their membrane-covered sockets as the horror stuck at me, a single triple-jointed arm lashing out and bashing into my chest. The thing hit with the strength of a feral beast, bolts of pain shooting through my chest as I felt my sternum pop. The lightning-fast blows sent me skidding and stumbling backwards, the sensation of weightlessness overtaking me as I tumbled down into the pit at my back. I was still attempting to suck in air in response to the creature's painful strike when I hit the water, forwarded, and stinking liquid rushing into my mouth and throat. I had landed almost directly onto the carcass of the dog, the floating mass of rotten meat and fur all but dissolved as I passed through it, clouding the already foul and murky water with disintegrating particulates of decomposing animal which stuck to my teeth as I thrashed in the murk. I lurched upwards out of the shallow pool, alternately gasping for air and vomiting bile and rainwater corrupted by rot. Blood laced with adrenaline roared in my ears. I could hear the sounds of desperate struggle above, crashing branches and splattering mud accompanied by Randy's screams of pain and terror. I scab bled at the slick moss and roots around me, desperately attempting to haul myself the short distance out of the stinking pit. Slipping on wet vegetation and collapsing mud, I managed to drag my head and shoulders above the lip of the old sinkhole. I saw Randy struggling against the pale thing that stalked the old growth, pinned to the churned ground with its drooling mouth and long hooked nose mere inches from his face. He clenched his fists and kicked his legs impotently as it pressed him down into the damp forest floor. I watched on in horror as the thing craned its neck downwards with an almost serpentine sway, joints creaking in its spine as it did so. It parted its long, blunted teeth and a tongue emerged, a thin whipping tendril segmented and smooth as the skin of an impossibly distended leech. For a split second the tar-black tongue hovered, dripping thick ropes of phlegmy drool before lashing down Randy's throat. His intensifying screams were muffled as the horror leaned in, embracing him in this foul, lipless perversion of a passionate lover's kiss. They held their struggling for long, agonizing seconds as I hauled myself fully out of the pit. It then craned backwards, turning its horrid face to meet my terrified stare. Its worm-like tongue snaked back into its gullet as Randy gasped for breath under its grip. Its teeth clenched in a disgusting mockery of a grin, glistening bands of viscous spittle still bridging the gap between it and its victims' mouths. I sat sprawled on all fours at the edge of the pit as it released Randy, spectral grace belying its monstrous size as it rose to its full, towering height. Joints and tendons creaked within its gaunt and jaundiced body as it took slow and purposeful steps towards my prone form. A deep croaking click slowly emanated from the depths of its throat as it reached towards me with filthy black fingernails. With a sudden jerk, I was yanked violently to my feet and dragged to the side. It was Randy, coughing with exertion as he pulled me by my shirt collar. "Come on and run," he gasped, not letting go of me as he began sprinting into the woods that surrounded us. I pumped my legs to keep up, the speed of terror propelling me. We dove through the old growth, ancient trees seeming to twist around us in the growing darkness. Mud clotted our boots and threatened to pull us to the ground with every step we took. I followed Randy, hoping to God he had a destination and was not simply running into the woods in a panic. Looking over my shoulder, I could not see the thing following us, but I could hear it somewhere in the gloom as it laughed and called, noises like the hellish fusion of a squealing pig and cackling lunatic. I don't know how long we fled into the deepening night. The sun had disappeared completely by the time we stopped, panting for breath and nervously eyeing the woods around us. Randy, keeled over with his hands on his knees, gave a short grunt and waved a finger past me. I turned to check what he was pointing at and saw a dark shape looming out of the darkness, the squat and blocky bulk of a lightless cabin. I helped Randy towards the structure as he fumbled around in his pockets, producing a jangling and heavily laden keyring. He seemed sluggish, as if the run had taken a steep toll on his body. We crossed the creaking porch with haste. The cabin was a plain thing of log timbers, beaten and drained by weather and age until they were desiccated and gray. I stared grimly at the old wooden door, which bore a crude and obviously recent carving of an apex. Randy shoved an old-fashioned iron key into the lock and shoved the door open, hurrying inside. I followed. Randy fumbled ahead of me in the darkness, rattling objects which I could not see. I heard the telltale rasping of a lighter followed by the flash of the flint. Then, after excruciating seconds, the flickering glow of a tiny fire sent dancing illumination to weakly fill the space around us. The cabin was tiny, one room of maybe 15 feet on each side. A small cast iron stove, choked beyond usefulness by thick layers of rust, with an old pile of firewood at its side, stood at my right. Directly ahead was a square table on which rested an eclectic gathering of woodworking tools and dining utensils in haphazard stacks, as well as the flickering candle that Randy had lit. 2 stools waited tucked underneath the table's lip. At the back of the room was a simple bed, sheets stretched across its lumpy mattress almost entirely eaten by moths and mice. Small glass-paned windows glinted in the candlelight. Everything was drenched in dust and the smell of mildew, obviously untouched for years. Randy lurched past me, slamming the door shut and ramming the deadbolt closed. As he moved close to me, I could smell foul sweat dripping from his pores. "Help me lock the shutters," he grunted. I moved to oblige him, pulling the heavy wooden shutters over the small windows and looping the hook locks closed. He talked quietly as he worked to close the windows on the other side of the cabin. Great-grandpa's hunting cabin. Came out here once or twice when I was a kid with my old man to check on the property after Grandpa sold it off. He paused to expel a hacking cough. Lucky I even remembered where it was. I glanced over my shoulder as I moved to the final window on my side of the room. "Randy, what the hell is that thing?" "Your guess is as good as mine. I ain't ever seen anything like that before in my life." I heard him take a shaky breath. My granddad used to say something wasn't right with these woods. Would tell us things. My old man would tell him off for spinning ghost stories. Christ, well, what do we do now? Fuck me, I should never have come back. The hinges creaked as I forced the shutters up against the window. "Yeah, maybe you shouldn't have." Randy trailed off as he struggled with his own window behind me. "Randy." I probed as silence began to grow. As I slowly turned to see the cause of the quiet, a foul sound and stench assaulted my senses. A wet, rumbling expulsion of gas and a viscous splattering upon the ground, and the burning odor of sickness, sulfur, and shit brought stinging tears to my eyes. "Jesus Christ, Randy. Are you fucking kidding him?" The angry words caught in my throat as I whirled around to face him. Randy stood facing me, shivering in place. His face, gaunt and pale, streamed with sweat and tears which ran and pooled in the deep wrinkles of his skin. Dark circles, the deep purple of an old bruise, had formed under his eyes, which stared blankly ahead, pooling with liquid and glassy like those of a dead animal. His nose and lips dribbled with spit and mucus. Foul sludge ran from his pant legs to pool around his boots. It was as black as tar and watery, with clots of solids the color and consistency of old, boiled coffee grounds. The smell was unbelievably horrid. Randy parted clammy lips and whispered a quiet, "Well, damn," before collapsing to the ground in a pool of his own sickness, sliding down the old timbers to lay sprawled against the cabin wall. Gagging and fighting back panic, I rushed to his side. He rolled his head weakly to face me, the drool dripping from his lips beginning to run as black as the stuff that gathered underneath him. "Oh my God, Randy, what's happening?" I took his sweat-drenched hand in my own. "Granddad got sick like this. Came back from the woods one night. Came back like this." Randy let out a slow, gurgling cough. God, nobody knew what happened. He didn't even make it through the night. We all watched him in his bed, screaming. Screaming that it had rotted his insides. That it had got him. Nobody knew what he was talking about. Lord help me. His breath was feverishly hot on my face and smelled of compost and spoiled meat. As he spoke, the boards of the cabin's front porch let out a painful creak. Randy let out an agonized moan as a fresh spew of black foulness joined the pool below him. "Oh God, oh God. Please." Spittle as dark as pitch ran freely from his mouth now. He stared with begging eyes towards me. "Please. Kill me." The Beck-shaped rash on my chest felt as if it were on fire. Slow, taunting scratching rattled along the door. With his free hand, Randy groped at my side. His face was a shattered mosaic of pain and strenuous effort drenched in the sweat of sickness. With a weak grunt, he brought his hand up. Clutched in his pale and shaking fingers was my pocket knife, the one my dad had given me long ago. He pressed the folded blade into my hand. "Please. Please. Don't let me die like my grandpa did. Kill me," he softly begged. The door at my back groaned as slow, even pressure was applied. Randy's sorrowful and cloudy eyes stared at me as I unfolded the tiny knife, a small sliver of glinting metal shining in the candlelight. My chest was a stinging matrix of pain. I held my breath as I stared at the little implement in my hand, then back to Randy. There was a sharp pop and clatter as the deadbolt snapped and fell to the floor behind me. "Please." As the cabin door creaked open with a dreadful creak, I ran my pocket knife across Randy's throat. A gush of blood, blackened and corrupted by sickness and rot, splashed over my hands and lap. It was nearly unbearably hot, burning with fever heat. He gasped and gurgled through a shredded windpipe for a pained final moment before falling silent and further slumping soundlessly into the mess beneath him. The stench of decay poured from his body. I kneeled there sobbing as the floorboards behind me creaked and shifted with a heavy weight. A throaty click emanated from directly above my head. I closed my eyes. A weighty hand came to rest atop my skull, inhumanly long fingers stroking my face. I sat immobile as creaking joints moved above me. More deep chittering. The sound of wet dragging and a hefty thump. The hand left my head. The wet sounds and creaking floorboards retreated towards the door, and then were replaced by the crackling of something dragged across the forest floor deeper into the old growth. I sat in the cabin, eyes screwed tightly shut, drenched in the stench of rot, and knees soaking in blood and filth, until weak rays of sunlight warmed my back through the open doorway. I opened my aching eyelids. Randy was gone, his corpse pulled away, leaving behind a black trail of coagulating gore and shit which disappeared out into the woods. My pocket knife lay in front of me, tiny blade stained and sticky. I left it there as I rose to shaking feet. Mindlessly, I wandered the old growth. I trudged like a dead man, unfeeling and unthinking. I must have stumbled circles around the forest for hours, filthy pad legs sticking to my skin with every step. In the end, I found myself staring at my truck, my faithful old Piper, through bleary eyes. On the stark white paint of her hood, smeared in rotten black gore, was a huge forester's Bex. A squealing cackle echoed somewhere in the distant woods. Where the filthy lines crossed in the center of the hood rested my pocket knife, clean and folded. The world has all but forgotten the old growth. But I never will. Thank you for listening to Night Whispers. If the shadows kept you company tonight, leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you're listening from. And if you're brave enough, like, subscribe, and come back next time. Just don't follow the voice in the trees.